however we are going to achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians, we'll give them all the powers to govern themselves, but will not give them powers to launch rockets or attack us. And as for the specific modalities, that will have to be discussed. The October 7th attacks really shocked the British public. For the first time, we saw the Houses of Parliament and Downing Street lit up in the colours of the Israeli flag, because as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said in Jerusalem next to our Prime Minister, the UK wants Israel to win. The UK wants Israel to win, to bring back the hostages, to defeat Hamas, because it understands that if an army of terror can conduct such barbaric atrocities and get away with it, that augurs poorly for democratic societies all over the world. And part of what we are doing, part of what I'm doing in this media tour of the UK 100 days on, is to remind people what they knew to be true on October 7th, not to let the memories of those atrocities recede into history, and definitely not to let anyone forget the hostages who are still trapped in the Hamas terror dungeons.
Well, let's just listen to what the opposition politician Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, said to us this morning about his feelings about the conflict between Israel and Hamas.
We're all concerned about the mounting civilian casualties and whether this action is proportionate compared to the threat. I think the October 7th attacks were barbaric, completely unjustified, and we shouldn't lose sight of the nature of the horror that was inflicted on innocent Israelis. So in that context, Israel has both the right and responsibility to defend itself, but it also has a responsibility to act proportionately and within international law. And I think there are mounting questions about whether Israel is doing that, not least given the statements we've seen from senior Israeli government officials who seem to have broader war aims beyond self-defense, the return of hostages and the degradation of Hamas. And I think it's particularly concerning to see the Israeli government distancing itself from the two-state solution.
Number of things arising from that. The first is, how much longer can killing at the rate which has gone on, including killing of civilians, how much longer does Israel intend to carry on with that campaign?
Of course, we mourn every civilian casualty in this war that Hamas launched and is choosing to wage from inside urban areas, trying to keep civilians as human shields. And so as we conduct this war, we take very seriously our obligations under international law to keep civilians protected. That is why, for example, before beginning the ground offensive, we urge civilians to get out of northern Gaza temporarily for their own safety. Now notice that the people who want Hamas to win this war then accuse Israel of displacing Palestinians when we are in fact complying with our obligations to try to keep them safe.
But you've also bombarded some of the areas you move people into.
Well, we've been urging them to go to a specific humanitarian zone where Hamas has not embedded itself under civilian areas. And it's important to understand what is happening now in Gaza, because Hamas has spent the last 16 years deliberately building its military infrastructure underground and keeping civilians above ground.
We understand the difficulties, but at the same time, over 20,000 people have been killed, which you accept now in Gaza.
Those are the Hamas numbers that have not been verified. But yes, the nature of civilian casualties is, of course, tragic.
Of which half of them are probably, at least half of them are probably civilians rather than combatants, by your own figures.
If that is the case, then that would be a very favourable civilian to combatant ratio compared to other counter-terror wars such as ISIS, Afghanistan, Iraq. Obviously, every civilian casualty is a tragedy.
So my question to you is, how much longer can killing at this rate go on?
We have moved to a less intense stage of the fighting now, having completely destroyed Hamas's governing infrastructure in northern Gaza. We're moving towards more targeted raids in the center, but we're continuing with our campaign to bring back the hostages and destroy Hamas, because the first thing that Hamas did after it abducted those people was to tell us that one October 7th was not enough, and it wants to do it again and again. Unfortunately, there is no way to climb out of this cycle of violence with Hamas still in power.
So people should just expect it to go on.
You know, I heard a very interesting statement this morning, actually, by Layla Moran from the Liberal Democrats, who said they want to see a bilateral ceasefire that gets aid in, hostages out, and Hamas out of power. And we completely agree. We want to see Hamas out of power. Unfortunately, it isn't too keen on laying down its arms, but the option of a Hamas surrender is still there. And we think anyone who is seriously concerned for civilian casualties should be demanding that. Not a ceasefire that leaves the rapists of Hamas in power, but a ceasefire that gets them to lay down their arms, release the hostages, and relinquish power.
Now, the other thing that Wes Streeting is talking about is a two-state solution. What happens once Israel is satisfied with its military advance? And it has to be said, the White House, Downing Street, the international community are all saying there's got to be a two-state solution, which will involve a Palestinian state alongside a state of Israel. Yet, your Prime Minister is rejecting that.
The question of how we achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians is one of the most controversial issues in Israel. But if there's one thing that everyone from left to right agrees, there is no room for Hamas in that vision, and that is why we are focusing on destroying Hamas.
Does Israel accept the principle of a two-state solution, which goes back to the Oslo Accords? Because, frankly, your Prime Minister's been rejecting it, hasn't he?
The principle that guides our approach to the conflict with the Palestinians is that the Palestinians should have every right to govern themselves, but none of the rights to threaten us. We are talking, in the case of the West Bank, about a large mountain range 20 times the size of Gaza that overlooks Tel Aviv and surrounds Jerusalem, populated by people, 82% of whom, according to Palestinian polls, think it was the correct decision for Hamas to launch the October 7 massacre. And so many Israelis, even those who are in principle open to territorial compromise with the Palestinians, will be asking serious questions about whether it is possible to relinquish territory without creating the sort of power vacuum that would see it being taken over by terrorists who would launch the sorts of atrocities they did on October 7th. For us, October 7th is a moment that has changed everything. Nothing will ever be the same again, and we will understand everything through that lens.
I understand that, but the international community has, broadly speaking, been sympathetic to the state of Israel because it has accepted the right of the Palestinians ultimately to have a state when the people in control in Palestinian territories have not accepted it conversely, although there was an offer, as you know, or several offers historically to do that. Mm-hmm. However, I would put it to you that if Israel is no longer accepting the principle of there being a two-state solution, you are going to lose international support dramatically.
I hear that. We want to achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians, and one of the major stumbling blocks there is the intense level of radicalization and extremism in Palestinian society. As I said, in the West Bank, 82% of Palestinians think it was the correct move.
But here's a question someone's put in. Is the best way to stop your enemy killing your babies to kill their babies?
We think that what would encourage extremism around the region is if Hamas gets away with the massacre it perpetrated on October 7th. You know, in 1944, no one said if you keep bombing Germany, you'll create a new generation of Nazis. The answer was to remove the Nazis from power and then have a serious process of de-radicalization. And we want to see the same thing here. We want to see the next generation of children in Gaza.
You're not saying to me you accept that there will ultimately be an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel.
We accept that however we are going to achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians, will give them all the powers to govern themselves, but will not give them powers to launch rockets or attack us. And as for the specific modalities, that will have to be discussed.
Well, can I ask you about the specifics? Because if it isn't a two-state solution, what is it? What does that solution look like to you?
We would like to see the Palestinians having all the rights to govern themselves, but not to relinquish security control in a way that would leave us exposed to having rocket fire on Tel Aviv with 20 seconds notice as opposed to 90 seconds notice from Gaza. We think that in order to have any sort of political settlement, Palestinian society, unfortunately, will require a process of de-radicalization. It will require the world to tell them some difficult truths.
And who would run that kind of de-radicalization program?
Well, at the moment in the Gaza Strip, we have most children being educated by a UN agency, UNRWA, which exists to perpetuate rather than solve the Palestinian refugee crisis. We have a very serious problem with extremism and incitement among UNRWA teachers, raising children to embrace jihad and martyrdom and extremism. And we would like to see the international community understand its own obligations to try to de-radicalize Palestinian society and make sure that the next children... The next generation realize there is a future. There is a future of peace and prosperity, but it's next to Israel, not instead of it. We're not there yet.
Would, in your vision of establishing security, does that involve Israel withdrawing some of the illegal, in international community's view, some of the illegal settlements?
We are focusing at the moment on destroying Hamas in response to October 7th. And you're asking me questions about long-term political horizons that I hope the day will come when we can seriously address how we are going to achieve that broader reconciliation with the Palestinians. But in order for us to get there, Hamas has to be removed from the picture, because if this war ends with Hamas in power,
Right.
if this war ends with Hamas being heroes of the Palestinian people, that's going to set back the cause of peace.
Here's another comment coming in. It is Israel's failure to give the Palestinians any hope that breeds extremism. The Israeli government needs to show vision, or extremism and violence against Israel will inevitably continue.
On the contrary, the PLO was established in 1964, before the Six-Day War, before Israel came in control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If you listen to what people are chanting here on the streets of London, when they chant from the river to the sea, there's sovereign Israeli territory in the middle. They're not calling to live next to Israel, they're calling to replace it. And unfortunately, these cries give succor to the most fervent extremists.
Although we did come to an accord between your former Prime Minister Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, so that
the temporary accords,
because people can give ground, and it sounds to me that you're not even putting anything on the table for the Palestinians.
No, we think that in order to move towards a future of peace and prosperity, and it is possible, and it can be done, but that will require Hamas to be removed from power. And if we get to a position, if we really get to a position where the Palestinian people say, we accept the sovereign right of the state of Israel to exist in secure borders, and we want to live next to you and not from the river to the sea, as they're chanting on London, the same people who are chanting for more Houthi attacks on British ships,
Well, I was going to ask you
they'll
about
have a completely different reality.
Let's ask you about that, because we're going to be talking about Iran next, and Iran's kind of influence in this and other conflicts. What do you make of when you hear people chanting in support of the Houthis and those attacks in the Red Sea and calling on Yemen to turn another ship around? What do you think about that?
It's horrific. In recent weeks, we've heard chants for intifada on the streets of London. London has had a taste of intifada. That was the 7/7 bombings. It was suicide bombings. And we have been saying to the British public, you have a domestic extremism problem here that you need to contend with. And now we see people on the streets of London calling for attacks on British forces, calling for attacks on British ships, calling for attacks that are only going to drive up the cost of living that everyone here knows is already very high. There is a serious domestic extremism problem of people who are choosing to take the side of the pirates of the Houthis and the rapists of Hamas. And I hope this moment allows the British public really to understand the way that the world is divided. You have the Houthis and the Hamas, they are allies. And you have the UK and Israel, and they are allies. And we are both fighting different proxies of the same Iranian regime that despises our way of life, wants to destabilize our region, and wants to sow chaos as a way for Iran to extend its control and its influence, its malign influence across the Middle East.